Oh, that would be great.
She's not, there was no engagement party, but I just want to do it. I really like my cousin. She's very special. And I like her family.
Yeah, I'm attached to my cousins too.
What else? So I want to go there. And I hope they have a nice night, maybe something engraved, like.
I haven't been there in months, so I can't tell you.
And I might.
Because they don't have any tours for docents. They do, but you're moderator online.
Yeah,
I don't need to read a script and
did
be
go
online
there.
and go through all the anxiety of getting on time and connecting. And
I did go
that's
there.
not fun. And then wait for, somebody to ask me a question from a text. There's just,
Yeah.
so I didn't.
Well, I went there when I saw the exhibit. I did it on my own, and
Yeah.
it was good. But
That's where I was at with it too. I was not overly
impressed.
enthused.
Right.
And I started to take the training for it.
Yeah.
And it was the day I got in the accident, October 20th, with my car. And so I missed the training.
Any news about the car? So.
I went and talked to my mechanic who had looked at it, and he told me to get a lawyer. And so I called the lawyer who's been sending me Christmas cards for 10 years,
Yeah.
because of Ken, and he said he only does bodily injury. He's an injury lawyer. And so I talked to my son last night for an hour and a half. I talked to Abby.
Good morning.
3.
Hi.
How are you?
Yes, I'm doing this for my mental health.
There's going to be more today.
I was inside for 2 days solid, right?
Oh, how many people were here last night?
44.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It was nice being in there.
I know. Rabbi Jonathan was so upset because the
Hello? Yes.
the projection wasn't
Yes.
working in the man.
Thank you.
And,
Bye.
and Roger didn't need to say anything about that.
Oh, thank
He
you.
did.
Thank
He
you.
didn't need to. Okay. But, obviously the
Good.
issue was people
I'll
would be
keep that in mind. Bless you.
looking
Bye.
Good morning.
at the wrong site.
How are you today?
Excuse me. Thank you. Sandy said that they could, for my conversation on the live stream. I'll let the lawyer. Thank goodness I didn't mention the names, and I think I'm just gonna mention to you, or that they can hear our, Sandy C. just called me and told me that they can hear our conversation on the live stream. Since I was talking to Jackie about personal things, it's a good thing to know. I didn't think it was turned on yet.
That would make sense. It's not.
Even with your glasses on your head. Glasses on your head.
Yes, I know. Because they go up like that.
What a pain, all this stuff around here. So, no, we can't just look at the voices now. So I talked to my son for an hour and a half last night. Because after I talked to Abby, she said, you might want to wash. I said, really? I talked to him like 4 or 5 days ago. She said, well, she's so diplomatic. His dog died. And Lincoln was very sweet. I know it's only a dog, but we all loved him. And he was Leo's cousin, his dog's cousin, and they played together a lot. I got into the loving dog thing. I didn't have to walk him all the time.
It's
Sam.
1:30 on Thursday.
From it.
Thursday.
He had
Tulsa is okay with you.
chemotherapy that worked wonders, but he started to get sick. Anyway, my son is really smart. He helped me with the car. Because I told him I was worried about it, but not replacing the transmission, if not being fixed. And he said, go look at the piece of paper that State Farm sent you with all the things that they're gonna replace. And I said, it's not listed there. And he said, it's sometimes connected to the engine, and make sure that they don't weld it on, if it's on, screwed on, if something's wrong, you know. And then I said, well, how do you know that they didn't order it? And he said, look at the numbers. Sure enough, that's still, or this invoice now. And then all you have to do is go to Google and you type in 21K 1212, which were the numbers. Here it comes out, Miata, 2000 Miata transmission. And he's so smart about stuff like this. You know what I'm talking about? He's not a mechanic. So I was worried about them replacing it, so it will be replaced.
Good morning.
I don't care, I don't want the car back now, I just have to store it till spring. I hope they keep it until March, till the snow is gone.
Starts. Good, how about you?
You know? So we'll see. I'll call you.
Good morning, good morning. Hi.
Hi.
Good morning. Hi, how are you?
Pretty good. The parking lot's surreal with those snow mountains.
Yeah, so true. And you know, at intersections, with the snow piled up, you can't really see who's coming the other way. Gotta be careful about
The
that.
roads were pretty good though.
The roads,
The
yeah.
main roads.
Yeah, that's true. No, I think that's true. Well, we are a mighty five.
It's a gorgeous day out there.
It is a beautiful day, isn't
You're
it?
not afraid of a little cold, yeah.
Oh, God, really? This is Cleveland.
I know. Exactly.
Yeah, it's so funny. Oh, man. How's everybody doing?
Very good.
Good, good. Well, we've opened up again. Last night we had, how many? 40, 45, something like that. I think the weather has been a little bit of an impediment, but I'm sure we'll gain some momentum over time.
It's hard to figure out what's live and what's online, what's canceled. I wasn't sure about this morning. I had to call Jackie.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I knew that they were live last night, but the storm was still
And you know,
snowing and not everything was plowed and, you know, it's really, and it's at night, you know, when it's dark, so.
we love being together, but you know, the technology has really made it possible for us to have an alternative. And you know, when the weather seems threatening or there's something else going on or we just don't feel like going out, we have an alternative. And it'll be interesting, we've talked about this for 2 years now, what it will look like once we're 6 months into having been opened up, what the ratio will be of people coming and not coming. Anyhow, Shabbat Shalom, welcome to those of you who are live streaming. You know that we are now opened up with some ongoing restrictions. We have people in the room here, which is wonderful to see, but I know that many of you are tuning in via live stream, so it's wonderful to have you too. I brought my phone. I, in a way, got out of the habit of looking at it every week, but I'm going to try to about halfway through. So those of you who have some questions remotely from your remote place, we'll try to handle that too. So, you know, when we arrive at a special moment, we say Shechianu. One of the reasons, a powerful one for me in any event, is that my calendar is so full. I'm doing so many different things that I don't have time really, or haven't made the time just to step back and realize how blessed I am, how many wonderful things are in my life, you know. We move from morning to night, and then we go to sleep, and we get up, and we move from morning to night, and we don't step back to realize how lucky we are. And blessings, prayers, I think, are ways of reminding ourselves not only about our blessings, but about the nature of things and so on. Prayers, I've always thought, are like the old strings around our finger, reminders that we have to do something. So, at this first moment of having opened up again, let's say the Shechianu together. You guys can join in the Shechianu too, because you're part of this larger enterprise, and soon I know many more of you will be back. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Shehechiyanu v'kiyomanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. We praise you, Lord, our God, sovereign of the universe, who has kept us alive, sustained us, and enabled us to arrive at this special moment. Amen. I do remember on a couple of occasions throughout my career, I've gone, just as I did now, gone down the wrong path for a prayer. And generally, people follow me right down into the wrong path, you know? I mean, if you want to do B'rei Priya Gofen for the Motzi, go ahead, we're with you. And I caught myself. Okay, blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord, our God, sovereign of the universe, who sustains us, who commands us to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, so we are looking this year at Immanuel Kant's 4 questions. What can I know? How ought I to act? For what can I hope? And what does it mean to be human? We looked at the beginning of the year at what does it mean to be human from the biblical perspective, and now we're knee-deep into how ought I to act. And soon enough we will turn to our third topic, for what can I hope. So we are looking now at various ethical principles, various commandments in the Torah, and we've looked at caring for the stranger, and now last week we looked at the issue of forgiveness. And we added another component to this discussion, and that is the imitation of God as one of the ways of understanding what our obligations are. Just as God did X, so are we to do X. And it is an answer to the question, what is the source of my obligations? Is the source divine command? When God commands, I must obey, and there's plenty of that in the Bible. Is another source observing the natural world and drawing ethical conclusions from that, the so-called idea of natural law? Is the source of my obligations in narrative? And we looked at that. We examined the story of David and Bathsheba, and then Nathan coming in and rebuking David. And we discovered that by a careful reading of those narratives, we can draw out certain implications, say about the power of relationship, the way in which David has not honored the relationship between Bathsheba and Uriah, and that part of what is hard to command, but part of any ethical culture, is the sense of reverence for the relationships of others. Another source of what we ought to do now is the idea of the imitation of God. So you can see that our question, what ought I to do, can be divided into components. just what are my obligations, that's one aspect of the situation, but also what are the sources of my obligation. And we might think, if we just have a casual understanding of the Bible, that the sources of my obligations are only one: God commanding. And God said to Moses, command the Israelites to do X, Y, and Z. But we see really that the Bible opens up different sources of my obligation, which I've just kind of reiterated in a few minutes before. There's a third question, and that is, what are the consequences of doing or not doing my obligation? That would be a kind of utilitarian approach. Does doing the right thing have salutary, beneficial consequences? Honor your father and your mother. Why? So that you may live long on the land that the Lord your God has given you. That is a consequentialist, utilitarian view of ethics, that doing the right thing has utility. It moves toward the good. Why should I honor my mother and father? Well, I could understand in a variety of ways. That's what I'm commanded to do, period. That's what God said to do. What gives God the right to command me? Why should I obey the laws given by God? Because God brought us out from the land of Egypt. God is the one who sponsors and enables freedom and allows me to live a full life. Given that, I have some obligation back. And God said, honor your father and mother. Why should I? Don't ask why. God, the God who is authorized to command, commands me. I could say honor your mother and father because inherent in that relationship emerges the idea of honor. My parents brought me into the world. I didn't bring them into the world. I owe everything to my parents, or I owe the foundation of everything to my parents. And that's the reason. The reason is inherent in the relationship. Or so that your days might be long. There are consequences for the family, for society, if we honor our parents. Society is more stable. You may dwell long on the land, and so on. So the issue of the role of consequences, should I do something for its utility? Maimonides, in the third section of the Guide for the Perplexed, says that we have an obligation, two obligations, the tending to our souls and the tending to our bodies. And if we do so, good things emerge.
What are the obligations to honor your parents?
You have to say it a little louder.
What are the obligations to honor your parents if there's an abusive relationship?
Right, exactly.
How do you do that?
So, Jackie is asking one of many kinds of questions that can be asked about any commandment. Is the commandment absolute and irrespective of other features of, let's say, the relationship? Or if the relationship is a difficult one, what is my obligation? And the commentators do say a lot about this. I do have a kind of absolute obligation to honor and to revere my parents. Even if, you may remember what Maimonides says, even if you're conducting services and your mother comes and slaps you in the face and throws your possessions to the ground, still we have an obligation to honor them, because there is something absolute in the relationship, and that is they brought me into life. On the other hand, there are limits to this. If my parents are abusive to me, I still have some obligation to them, but the obligation diminishes. I still have an obligation to see to some degree their well-being, but there are consequences to that. You see, I'm stuttering a little bit because I'm not sure exactly what our tradition says at this point. I have an absolute obligation, but my parents have a role too. My parents have to understand that they are not sole powers in the family relationship. They must teach me, you shall teach your children. And if they fail in that obligation, and now I'm not sure about what comes next, my obligation to them diminishes. But about this I'm not sure. There's a wonderful book on it, and if I remember, I'll go back and take a look and see if I can come up with what the right answer is to this. Okay, so last week we looked at God's forgiveness, which is illustrated in many passages in the Bible. And then I read a very famous midrash on imitating God, which I want to look at again and then go on from there. So this is from the Talmud, Tractate Sotah, the suspected wife in Numbers chapter 11. Is it? Or Numbers 6? 5? I think it's Numbers chapter 5. Or is it Leviticus? Anyhow, okay. But the Bible takes this up. Now, this is really an interesting and synthetic redescription of God's goodness. By that I mean this passage in my version, maybe 12 lines, quotes the Bible 6 times. 3 quotes from Genesis, 3 quotes from Deuteronomy. So that's what I mean by synthetic. It is gathering a variety of excerpts and putting them together in a narrative around the topic, the imitation of God. Rabbi Chama, the son of Rabbi Hanina, further said, "What means the text, 'You shall walk after the Lord your God'?" A quote from Deuteronomy chapter 13. What does that text mean? You shall walk. How do I do that? Is it then possible? In other words, the next move is there's a big problem with this idea of walking after God. Is it then possible for a human being to walk after God? For has it not been said, another Deuteronomy quote, this time from chapter 4, "For the Lord thy God is a devouring fire." I have the commandment to walk after God, to follow God. But if God is in some sense a devouring fire, I'm going to get burned by walking after God. So what can this commandment to walk after God really mean? It doesn't look like it means literally, whatever literal might be. Does God walk? But following too closely. But the meaning is, and now the Midrash resolves this dilemma, is to walk after the attributes of God, God's ways. As God, and now here we get examples of how God acts. So God is acting in a way X, and I should walk in that way too. To follow after God is to emulate what God does. His attributes are attributes of action, how God acts. As he clothes the naked, for it is written, now quoting Genesis chapter 3, "And the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife coats of skin and clothed them." So should we clothe the naked. "The Holy One, blessed be he, visited the sick. For it is written," now quoting Genesis 18, "And the Lord appeared to him," to Abraham, "by the oaks of Mamre." You may remember the hospitality section in Genesis 18, verse 1 is, "And God visited Abraham." What does that mean? I have no idea. Visit just means come to him. What kind of visit was it? Well, Genesis 18 doesn't tell me, but Genesis 17, the immediately preceding chapter, tells me that Abraham circumcised his sons and circumcised himself. What immediately follows, although it might be years between chapter 17 and chapter 18, but the rabbis are assuming that what stands next to each other in the text stands next to each other in time. So that when Abraham is sitting in the doorway of his tent in the cool of the day, what's he doing? He's convalescing. How do I know this? Immediately before Abraham circumcised himself. And when God visits him, what could God be doing? Visiting the sick. You see the logic of that interpretation? The Holy One, blessed be he, visited the sick, for it is written, and the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre. So should we visit the sick. The Holy One, blessed be he, comforted mourners, for it is written, and it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed Isaac his son. What does that mean? I have no idea. But Abraham has just died. And God is bringing Isaac, his son, comfort. So we could infer, the rabbis do, that God is comforting the mourners. So should we comfort the mourners. Imitation of God's actions. The Holy One, blessed be he, buried the dead, for it is written, and to Deuteronomy, he buried him, Moses, in the valley. So should we bury the dead. This mitzvah of accompanying the dead to their burial place, a way of honoring the dead. God buried Moses. God attended to the burial of Moses. Doesn't that bring God down to human activity? Doesn't that lower the exaltation of God? We might say yes, but we might say no, because God here is a model for human behavior, and given that he's a model, God has to act in ways that human beings are called upon to act. The rabbis have no qualms about bringing God down to earth here to do, we might say, wonderful but mundane things. Clothing the naked, visiting the sick, comforting the mourners, burying the dead. And so this passage gives us yet another source of our obligations, from which the rabbis in another place ask, what is the heart and soul of the Torah? Can we infer from this a super principle? And the answer is yes. Loving kindness, chesed. The whole love, we see acts of loving kindness in God's four actions here. Caring for another at crucial points in their life. What gives the rabbis the right to say, and this is the very essence of the Torah? And the answer is, I'm inferring, that we can describe the whole in terms of the extremes of the continuum. These are the actions from one end to another, and if I have the end points, I have everything. God clothed the naked at the beginning. God buried Moses at the end. The Torah opens and closes with acts of chesed, of loving kindness, from which the rabbis infer the essence, the soul, the animating principle of the Torah is chesed. Now, you could say this is a stretch, because there are a lot of other things in the Torah. But the rabbis are, in a way, taking the dots. You remember the connect the dots thing. The dots of our lives are not, we don't have a blueprint about how to connect them. They're not numbered. The way children's books, dots are numbered, and if you follow the numbers, you draw a picture. And what you've done is you've made something coherent out of something which has no inherent coherence, right? Those dots, if they're unnumbered, don't require connecting them in any particular way. That's our life. The dots of the events of our lives, we could understand as dots. And I might like to ask, what is my life all about? And the answer to that question requires connecting the dots. And connecting the dots in one way puts aside all the other ways of connecting the dots. If there are 50 dots of my life, there must be an answer to this question. How many ways are there to connect those dots? A huge number. I don't know, maybe 50 factorial. I don't know. So there's no inherent way of connecting the dots. But what I can do is decide to connect them in a certain way. When I ask myself, what do I want to be when I grow up? What sort of vocation? I connected the dots of my life in a certain way. Did I ever second guess myself? Maybe I connected them in the not the best way. Yes, there was a moment in my life that I thought, maybe I've chosen the wrong way. And so I tried to connect them yet in another way. What the rabbis have done here is to take all the dots that emerge from the 5 books of Moses and connect them in a certain way. I think we could agree that they could have connected them in another way, or many ways. In other words, what the essence of any book, unless the author tells you what the author wants, is open for interpretation. And interpretations oftentimes emerge from desire, from the interest in drawing out some powerful... What the rabbis have done here is they're trying to make primary this idea of loving kindness. And they go about connecting 4 dots in order to draw that inference. And so I think that's a very interesting thing. Yeah, Candy?
Don't you think we should be suspicious if we see the rabbis have connected the dots in a way to empower them or provide their importance to the community? And that's a little outrageous to see that.
Is it self-serving?
Is it exactly?
Yeah. One of the things I say frequently is, if I want to care about something beyond myself, that is not incompatible with also caring for myself. In other words, the rabbis could be interested in their authority, and they want to boost it and secure it. The question is, I guess, twofold. Is that the only thing they want? And I would say the answer to that is no. The second question is, and what's wrong with that if it's moderated by other interests? After all, let me be a little personal here. So I stand in front of a congregation and sermonize. Why do you listen to me? Why do you take seriously if you do what I say? Well, partly because I've said some good things in the past and you're ready for some more good things. The other, though, is, when we talk about teaching, we often say that the teacher is the lesson. the integrity, the honesty of the teacher, the way in which the teacher responds to the students, is in itself a kind of lesson. If I'm teaching about the Civil War, you very well may respect me more or listen to me more or less, depending upon how much you respect me. And you're going to respect me, for example, to the degree to which that I'm fair-minded, that I'm honest, that I care about the students. If they sense that, they will all the more listen to what the teacher is saying. I have, therefore, an interest in being honest, in actually caring about the students. That is, I have to care also about my authority to be a teacher, to be a preacher. So it seems to me that the rabbis do care about their authority, but they don't do it in gratuitous ways. They do it through their interpretations and through their concern about the well-being of the community. So I would say that the rabbis, nor do any leaders, have to be utterly selfless if they're not going to be self-serving. They can care about themselves, both as people who deserve a good life, and in their role as teachers and leaders of the community. The question is, say this notion of chesed. That's really not your question, Candy, is it? Your question is, when the rabbis are drawing an inference about what the essence of the Torah is, and they're trying to make that normative, by that very act of making it normative, being definitive about it, aren't they just serving themselves? Because they want to be the powers in the community. But the question is, say in this one, do they serve the community by trying to draw the inference of what the essence of the Torah is? I say yes, because chesed, loving kindness, love, is the glue of society. And to assert by the authorities, who want to continue to be the authorities, something as powerful as that, this book that you all care about, it's really trying to convey to us one big thing. Care for each other. And that is an outreach to the community. They could have said, they could have connected the dots in other ways. They could have said power. Jacob tries to assert and secure power over Esau. The brothers over Joseph. Joseph later over the brothers. Cain over Abel. The essence of Torah is power. That would have been plausible too. And it would run into the same question that you're asking, because they're asserting their authority to decide. But that would not serve the community. If their teaching to the community is what this book, which we venerate, wants, is for every person to assert as much power as possible. And that would not conduce to the social good, would it? It would tear the society apart. So the rabbis are using their authority to connect the dots in a certain way. And in that sense, you may be right. They're asserting something about themselves, trying to hold on to power. But they're doing it in a way that makes the community better. And therefore, in a certain sense, they justify their authority to teach by saying something so powerfully productive for a community. I don't know. Carol?
Well, and then there's the Talmud that provides those different points of view, so that there were rabbis who may be trying to assert power. And there were other rabbis then who were pushing back, and all of that is recorded.
Yeah, that's a good point. What are you saying, actually? That it's very hard for any one individual or group to assert what the whole community will accept. Yeah. But that very process of interpretation is another example of asserting rabbinic authority. Who has the right to do X? The one who has the attributes that make that person possible to do X. I'd like to go out on the mound at Yankee Stadium and throw some pitches at some batters. I don't have the qualifications. So I can't do it. Who has the power, the qualifications to interpret Torah? Those who have studied it, those who have risen through the ranks, those who have been ordained by other authorities. That's an assertion of rabbinic power too, isn't it? Even though it's pluralistic in outcome, it's not pluralistic in qualification. Right? So there is that as well. But do you think I've got a good point that the true authorities are the ones who care about the community, but who also care about doing what qualifies them to be authorities? If I got up on Yom Kippur and just to give a sermon, and I just engage in stream of consciousness, I was thinking this morning about this, and without thinking about it, without going through a couple of drafts, without finding some justification for my positions rather than mere assertions. If I did that, you wouldn't take me as your teacher, and you would be right, because I haven't cared about what makes me qualified to give sermons. This is not the question of whether my sermons are good or not, but what qualifies me to do it. And I have to care about that. And I think the rabbis have to care about developing the characteristics that make them qualified as leaders of the community. Although they can blow it, they could interpret the Torah as the essence of Torah's power. Okay, so let's take a look in our Bibles at one instance of this notion of forgiveness. That's the topic we're looking at, and I want to look at the Joseph story, and I want to look at chapter 45 of Genesis. So, in chapter 44, you remember the story, of course. In chapter 44, when Joseph is about to assert his authority over the brothers, and they're terrified because now their ruse, their actions have been found out. And Judah gives this very impassioned speech, which essentially says, if you keep Benjamin and send us back, it will destroy our father. And that moves Joseph. And now, chapter 45. And Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone withdrawn from me. So there was no one else about when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. His sobs were so loud that the Egyptians could hear, and so the news reached Pharaoh's palace. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still well? That's an interesting first question that he asked, because the whole essence of Judah's speech was about the father, their father. But his brothers couldn't answer him, so dumbfounded were they on account of him. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come forward to me. And when they came forward, he said, I am Joseph, your brother. I'm going to read something from another source here, and this author, Aviva Zornberg, focuses on the I-you distinction. I am your brother, he whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me, you sold me here. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. It is now 2 years that there has been famine in the land. There are still 5 years to come in which there shall be no yield from tilling. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. Notice what Joseph is doing here as he's connecting the dots. What happened to me, what you did, but there is a third party involved in this picture, God. So, verse 8, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of all his household, and ruler over the whole world, land of Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me without delay. You will dwell in the region of Goshen, where you will be near me, you and your children and your grandchildren. There I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come. Let's go to chapter 50, verse 15. What has happened between chapter 45 and chapter 50 is Jacob has died. And the brothers are assuming, we can infer, that one of the ways in which they are protected from Joseph's wrath is the presence of Jacob. And now Jacob is gone. So they're worried that one of the supports for them is now gone and they're all the more vulnerable. Verse 15 of chapter 50. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong that we did to him? Joseph has in chapter 45 forgiven them to some degree, but they still bear some guilt and they're worried about revenge. So they sent this message to Joseph. Before his death, your father left this instruction. So shall you say to Joseph, forgive, I urge you, the offense and guilt of your brothers who treated you so harshly. So the brothers do one of two things here. They quote Jacob or they make up a story. And the difference between which one it is depends upon whether Jacob knew the story of what had happened to Joseph. And it's not clear that Jacob does, because you remember the brothers early in the story kill an animal and bring its bloody coat back, and this is your son. And for all Jacob knows, this is the end of the story. So it's possible, and Joseph certainly entertains this possibility, that the brothers are making this up to save themselves. But the issue of forgiveness has now been explicitly thematized. And Joseph was in tears as they spoke to him. His brothers went to him themselves, flung themselves before him and said, we are prepared to be your slaves. But Joseph said to them, have no fear. Am I a substitute for God? Besides, although you intended me harm, God intended it for good, so as to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. And so fear not, I will sustain you and your children. Thus he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. Okay, I think it's clear that Joseph, in some functional sense, has forgiven his brothers. There's another way of understanding this story, he says, that this is all God's doing. So don't berate yourselves. You were an instrument, even though you didn't know it at the time, of God's desire to get you out of harm's way in Canaan down to Egypt, where the Egyptians are treating us kindly. Now, I want to read a passage from Aviva Zornberg's wonderful book, The Beginning of Desire, where she discusses this very passage. And the title of this section of the book, it's on page 310, in case you're interested in following it up. The title of this section is The Therapeutic Narrative. The narrative that heals. Or in our terms this morning, the way of connecting the dots in order to promote the healing of the rift in the family. So here's Zornberg. If Joseph cannot find the right words at this point, then all is lost. The story has returned full circle to alienation, bafflement, and conflict. But Joseph has found himself. A process of confirmation has come to a head, and he succeeds in finding the nexus between their different realities. Going beyond I am Joseph, he talks of his connection to them. I am your brother, Joseph. So his first assertion is the assertion of an ongoing relationship, trying to overcome the possibilities of a kind of final alienation. Then Joseph said to his brothers, now she quotes the passage, I'll read it. Come forward to me. And when they came forward, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, he who you have sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me here. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. God sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, Lord of all his household, ruler over the whole land. Now this is Zornberg again. Joseph finds himself in relation to his brothers. His story is balanced on the axis of I, you, and you, me. It is an honest but discriminating account of what they did and did not do to him, of the limits of their responsibility for his disappearance. You sold me hither, but it was not you who sent me here. There's a kind of proximate cause and a more remote cause, we might say. The proximate cause is the brothers sold him to the Midianite traders. The more remote cause is that this is God's plan working itself out. The nexus between their realities, I and you, the nexus between their realities is God, who has choreographed their relationships, their absences and losses in order to save life. This is the story that Joseph tells. He is the one who sent Joseph to Egypt. The word is used 3 times to express God's purposeful perception. From the human perspective, Joseph was not gone. He had ceased to be in the line of sight. From God's perspective, he had been just where he was meant to be, swallowed up, giving and saving life. This is Joseph's therapeutic narrative, full of expressions of relationship, unblinking of the basic facts of the distance between you and me, but allowing God to take up the slack of that distance. Out of the brokenness comes a rethinking of the past, a redeeming of the past, a hope for wholeness in the house of Jacob. And I think the question that Zornberg's point raises is, does Joseph believe in the story, and does it matter? I mean, it's not clear. The notion of a therapeutic narrative might suggest that Joseph is making up this story for a higher purpose, to be able to forgive the brothers and heal the family and relieve them of their guilt. The author certainly thinks that Joseph's therapeutic narrative is the true explanation, but does Joseph? What do you think?
Doesn't matter. But this also brings up another thing. I don't know if you remember Geraldine in the comics, where she says, the devil made me do it.
Yeah.
It becomes an excuse. If you're going to blame everything that you do that's detrimental to other people on God, that's an excuse that you're having, that you can do all these things. I think that the central theme is more do unto others as you would have them do unto me, as a central theme of the Torah.
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. Are you
If-
saying
if
that...
God does these things and causes people to create harm to others, that becomes an excuse. I didn't do it. I didn't shoot that man. God made me shoot that man.
It's an interesting point, actually.
Or the devil made me do it.
Sure. Jim?
Well, I had a couple other points, but to your point, that's been the very premise of most wars.
Ah,
God's on our side. The other 100,000 people God doesn't know about. But,
yeah, right.
But, couple of points I noticed in what we're talking about, even though everybody's heard this story, a couple thousand times.
Yeah.
There's absolutely no mention of anybody's mother in all this. How's my father doing? Doesn't seem to remember he had a mother. I found it a little interesting.
Rachel has been dead. I can't remember about Leah, but anyway, yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah.
but it seems to me this forgiveness theme is a very Christian idea, and I don't know that we've had it in here before. It's like a premise for some of the Christian principles I'm aware of.
Okay, what? Like what? What's the connection?
But the forgiveness thing.
Yeah.
Whatever you did wrong, it's okay, God will forgive you.
Yeah.
But our teaching says you have to get forgiveness from the person you wronged. More important than God forgiving you, unless I've interpreted it wrong.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point. I mean, I'm not sure that it's fair to project back onto the biblical text what the rabbis say, but nevertheless, I'm wondering here. I mean, after all, the Christian notion, to the degree that I understand it, is that there's a vicarious atonement, that somebody else paid for my sins, and therefore I am forgiven. Here, at least, the players in the story are working pretty hard to what? I mean, Judah is working very hard to protect his father. Judah is willing, in other words, Joseph has said, you guys go back, I'll keep Benjamin. And Judah at least recognizes this will kill the father, because he acknowledges that Joseph and Benjamin, the two sons of his favorite wife Rachel, are his favorite sons, so that Judah has a reason to be resentful and feeling, well, let him take Jacob, let him take Benjamin. It'll serve Jacob, my father, it'll serve him right for favoring. But no, he puts aside his own possible resentment and thinks about his father. In other words, Judah is engaged in an act of self-transcendence for the sake of somebody else's well-being, which I think is the reason that Joseph bursts out into tears. He recognizes the sacrificial gesture on the part of Judah. And I think that encourages him to make a commensurate move toward the brothers. So the question that you're raising and that you've echoed is, do we have a principle here? Can we shift the blame from ourselves to something or somebody else? God did it. We're going to war because God wants it. We're serving God. You're free because God sent me here.
God had an ulterior motive.
And God had an ulterior motive, yeah. But I'm wondering, look, I don't know whether we can infer a principle from here, but what about the episode itself at least? Joseph, I think, has a goal, doesn't he? Joseph recognizes that the family is adrift, that the forces are all centrifugal, people alienated from one another. As an aside, I want to say that I think the author and the editor recognize that one of the themes of the book of Genesis is sibling rivalry. And let's take, I imagine the author asking him or herself, do brothers represent citizens? Can I make this following analogy? Brothers are to the family as citizens are to a community. And so the issue of sibling rivalry, a main motif in the book of Genesis, can, in the imagination of the author, represent not only itself, family rivalries, but a community that is torn apart by jealousies and so on. And the last of these episodes of sibling rivalry is the story of Joseph and his brothers. The author well knows that when Joseph brings the family down to Egypt, this is the beginning, although it's still a long way off, of the slavery, of the servitude of the Israelites in Egypt. Can a people in an alien country survive if the community lacks coherence and mutuality? If a community is riven by rivalries, it's weaker. And if it's in somebody else's territory and not its own, it's all the more weaker. So that the conclusion of the book of Genesis, where sibling rivalry is cured, we know the cure. What's the cure? Concern for the brother's mutual parent, something that transcends their relationship to one another, and also the element of forgiveness. And therefore the healing of sibling rivalry in the Joseph story stands for now, because we're transitioning to the book of Exodus. What comes next is 500 years later. But in terms of narrative, it comes next. It's the next thing. You close the book of Genesis and turn the page, you're in Exodus. And the people are now slaves. And so narratively, the editors, I think, want the Joseph story to represent the way in which a community can survive in all circumstances, but especially in desperate circumstances. And one is care for some mutual center, in the Joseph story, the father, and care for one another, so that here I'm trying to very circuitously getting to your point. I don't think we should infer a principle here that somehow this is a way of passing the buck and not being responsible. But I think what the story wants us to see is how communities find a way to heal their inevitable rivalries. And one vehicle for doing this is forgiveness. And one vehicle for forgiveness is to connect the dots in a way that promotes healing. I just talked to somebody last night after services. This person has been alienated from his or her sibling for many, many years. Recently, this person got a call from the alienated sibling and said, let's talk. That's Joseph, isn't it? That sibling now wants to try to connect the dots in a different way. Let's suppose the sibling is about to make up a story, which then promotes the healing of their relationship. So what? It's the motivation that stands behind it that matters. And so it seems to me an answer to your question is, it depends on what the goal is. What's the motivation? Is the motivation to relieve oneself of the burden of responsibility, or to try to heal a relationship? And if it's the latter, does it matter if you say the kind of thing Joseph said? That's my tentative response. Yes.
My quote is, I think that you shouldn't put God into the story. I think that Joseph was separated from his family. He was living with a bunch of alien people. It wasn't his normal way of life and so on, but he adopted it, but he still didn't feel 100% comfortable. He knew the good things and the bad things about his brother and his family, and when he saw them, he felt more at home with his family. And that caused him to want to forgive them and to reunite. And if you leave God out of the story, you still have the fact of forgiveness which you want to promote. But it isn't that God created the forgiveness, it's the community.
Yeah.
Which is what you're trying to say, I believe.
So what you're saying is that if the goal is forgiveness and reconciliation, why do they need to bring God into the picture?
Right.
Why can't they do it themselves?
Right.
Here's an off-the-cuff response. True, but why does there have to be only one way of doing it? In other words, let's now think of God also as a principle. There's a principle that we are devoted to that stands above and outside our relationship. And I'm going to appeal to this principle as a way of encouraging our reconciliation. I'm thinking of Lincoln in the Civil War. I don't know if this works or not. There was alienation between the North and the South. Of course, Lincoln could have tried desperately to bring the parties together to see if they can't find a way to reconcile themselves with one another. But Lincoln is also appealing to, out of many one, e pluribus unum, and that union is a principle that ought to unite the different parties. Now, the South didn't go for it. So in that sense, the appeal to principle failed. It took a war to bring them back together again. And as we know, there's still deep differences between North and South. But was it fair? See, you're suggesting No, let me reconstruct what you're suggesting in my terms. There are two approaches that Lincoln could have taken. He could have gone to Jefferson Davis and said, let's sit down and work this out. We're brothers. He didn't do that. Maybe he couldn't do it because the animosity by this time was too strong. And by the time he got into office, there was already some secession. Instead, he appealed to a principle. Was he wrong to do that? In other words, the role of that principle there is the role of God in the Joseph story. So I think your question comes down to, does it have to be the parties who do it, or can there be an appeal to something that they both feel the importance of in some way or another? Here my analogy breaks down, I think, because the South, I think, wasn't as devoted to Union as Lincoln was. I mean, he didn't go to, the Civil War wasn't about slavery initially for Lincoln. What about that? In other words, the structure of what Joseph does is he appeals to something outside the relationship in order to give the relationship some coherence and depth. Jim?
But he must be very concerned with the relationship, because think about normal civil rivalry, and now think about this situation where all these people have different mothers. The rivalry, the allegiance to the father in our world is a difficult one at best, that the father is the focal point. So put yourself in Joseph's spot. What was done to him was beyond horrendous.
Yeah.
Despite the fact he came out okay. For him to do this, he must have had an altruistic point of view that made him somewhat selfless, because otherwise I don't know how he could have done what he did. Whether he really believed it or not, I guess doesn't matter. But he saw the point that he had to do it to keep the whole thing together.
Yes.
So if you really try to think about what was going on in his head, it's somewhat amazing.
Yeah. Amazing in what sense? The selflessness?
That he had a principle that was above all these other things that most people really probably couldn't shake off.
Well, this is leadership, though, isn't it? The capacity to transcend differences and make it plausible, make it powerful.
Well, that's the point of the, a principle above and beyond the two parties.
Right. Well, Martin Buber has an interesting image of a community. It's the image of a wheel with spokes. And the spokes are the individuals, but the spokes, all of them, converge on the center, on the hub. So that we are individuals, but a community, if it's going to be a community, has to have some central focal point that is not is not related to partisanship, that one group over another. The brothers all had one father. They all have one God, as Joseph is trying to suggest. So, don't you think in our discussion we've evolved a sense of what it takes for forgiveness, not in all cases, but we all know that when we're jealous or we're upset or we think that someone has taken advantage of us, it's hard to put that aside. And a way of doing it seems to find common ground, which is important to both, which allows a healing or at least relativizing the grievances. In the example I used from my conversation last night, this sibling was suggesting, hey, we're sisters. Doesn't that sisterhood, sister one, sister two, sisterhood, and doesn't that transcend the differences that we have? And if the answer is no, it doesn't, then our alienation will continue. And no is a plausible answer in terms of, you know, what you did to me is unforgivable. I can't go there. Okay, that's plausible. The question is, does the principle, sisterhood, transcend, can you allow it to transcend the real rivalries that have been cultivated? And I think is that a lesson in forgiveness? That it may be, look, I don't forgive you. Don't come to me again. But don't you see that is hurting something bigger? A community, our relationship, which we could have. No, I don't want to do it. That's plausible. That's why I'm saying it like this. That's plausible. There's no inevitability. Forgiveness is hard. Can we find a way to transcend the real grievances we have? Not the made-up grievances, not the superficial, the real grievances. And the structure of Joseph's, and that's why I like Zornberg's therapeutic narrative. His main goal is healing. And he has found a means, whether it's true or false. And far from passing the buck, the brothers have worked hard to accomplish this. Judah has transcended his own needs. He's willing now to be a servant of Joseph in Egypt forever. And Joseph has transcended his needs for revenge for the sake of a larger good. In other words, they've worked hard. Joseph, in testing the brothers all of those times, never put the goblet in the cup. What's the point of putting the goblet in the cup? To see whether or not the brothers are going to sacrifice yet another brother to save themselves, because the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. So Joseph, through this ruse, has found out whether the brothers are willing to do what they did before. And he finds out they're not. They have grown in some way. Now that's hard work, to contrive that series of tests in order to see whether or not there's been change. There's change going on the ground. It's not gratuitous, is it? I forgive you. No, I have seen certain things. Yes?
It's interesting to me that really this whole thing started with Judah liking one of his sons, or two of his sons, much better than the others.
Jacob, you mean?
Yes, Jacob, I'm
Jacob.
sorry. Than the others. And that jealousy is what caused this thing to start, not really that God intervened. And at the end, here again, he says, supposedly, he says, forgive each other and let's reunite and bring the family back together. That was his message to the other brothers. So if you take that as not being made up by the brothers, or either way, it's a form of forgiveness of what was really started as a jealousy within the family.
And absolutely. And it's the only time in history that there's ever been this kind of sense of parental favoritism.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, so it is based upon human reality, the reality of the family. And, you know, I mean, one could infer from this that this is a story for us as well. Because, I mean, look, I mean, as some of you know, I travel a couple of times a year with my brother, my younger brother. And in our conversations over the years, this whole question of who the parents favored and so on has been a major theme of our relationship, and we've been able to talk it through. So this is an issue that faces all of us, doesn't it? Parental favoritism. Joseph looked like his mother, and Jacob loved Rachel more than all the other wives. Candy?
Well, you mentioned that things would have been when you open Exodus, you discover that the Jews are slaves.
Yeah.
And so that made me think that if Joseph had put the dots together differently,
Yes.
things would have turned out very differently.
Yeah.
And that means that you're elevating sibling rivalry and that problem over the peacefulness of the community, which eventually would have happened. And
What
so
would have
I
hap-
see Joseph as very manipulating in what he did,
Mm-hmm.
to the point where it might not be beneficial for the Jewish people. And so I don't understand about truth and if there's an ultimate truth that we should aim for, or ethics about goodness, if there's some goodness that's better than other goodness.
Interesting. Well, I'm not sure I'm following your point. You're relating this to the community in Egypt now, and maybe
Yeah.
Joseph didn't make
If Joseph had made different decisions,
Like-
maybe the Jews wouldn't have been slaves.
Oh,
If they hadn't come, if he hadn't been so manipulative in bringing them there. And so, is there ever a point where you should just let things be? And hope that God will take care of it? I don't know.
And let God take care of it, sure.
And so I see him not as being so altruistically forgiving, but as being manipulative, because he wanted them there to
He
make
wanted them there.
himself feel better.
Yeah.
And maybe that was not the right thing to happen.
Because if they didn't come down to Egypt, they wouldn't have
Yeah.
been enslaved in Egypt.
So when is it appropriate to act?
There you go.
And when is it appropriate to let things be?
There you go.
And so that's my question.
Yeah. I'll give you Aristotle's answer. The decision rests with a kind of intuition. Aristotle is a cognitive, let's call it a cognitive intuitionist. He believes that we can see in any particular situation what the right thing to do is. You can't have rules, I think Aristotle wants to say. You have to have cultivated the virtues, and then have the sagacity, the wisdom, the insight to be able to tell in a given situation what is the right thing to do. So I think Aristotle's answer to your question is, you can't tell. You just have to make the best judgment you have based on experience and based upon a set of general principles you've cultivated. Is this helpful? I don't know. So how do we ever know, I guess? No, after all, there was a dire situation. There was famine in Canaan. So that it's not right to say that they came down just because Joseph wanted them to come down. There was let's put it this way. There were two dangers. There's the danger of famine in Canaan, and there's the danger of Egypt. One was proximate, one was right there for them. The other is more remote, though in retrospect we recognize that coming down there eventuated in something problematic. But isn't it's fair, I think, to say that Joseph took the proximate problem and tried to resolve it. He couldn't have anticipated, and after all, it was 500 years later. I mean, the United States of America is only 238 years old, something like that. The Israelites were in Egypt for 400 years. You know, I mean, the Roman Empire finally fell, but I think we should not infer from that empire by definition is bad. The Roman Empire existed for 500-600 years before it finally eroded. So there were good times in Egypt. It wasn't a bad choice, even after they're now in Egypt. And the Torah is silent, of course,
Well,
about
I
this.
like that answer of proximity.
Yeah, yeah. Right.
Good.
The family-
So he did make the right choice, didn't he? Although we never know what's going to eventuate from our choices. All we can do is give our best shot. Yeah. Jackie?
Yeah, there's some issues. What is your name? I don't know you. Bennett? That Bennett mentioned about why does God always have to be in the picture? I mean,
Why does God have to be what?
always in the picture. I did it because God says, because it is God's will. With the families coming together, their sibling rivalry. And as you mentioned, you and your brother, you get together, you're always talking about it. But the basic thing, God isn't making you do that. You're doing it, you're
Right.
communicating. And it's not always God in the picture. You're communicating, you're expressing, you're talking about it, you are discussing. So are you going to say God is the higher force, and because of there's God's will that you and your brother are able to get together and talk about the jealousy that you may have thought of when you were young? What do you think?
Well, it's a big question.
I know.
You know, in the Joseph story, God does not act at all in the story itself. Joseph says at the end that this is God's doing, and I think, just to repeat what we've been thinking about, not necessarily decided, is that Joseph may be making this up as a therapeutic narrative, not really believing that. But in the story itself, Joseph appeals to God from time to time. You know, you remember he's in prison and the butler and the baker and so on. He interprets their dreams. And he said, no, I don't do the dreams. God is the one who interprets the dreams. But in fact, the only way God enters this story up until Joseph's narrative is by being appealed to, not by acting. God does not act in this story. This is why scholars believe that the origin of the Joseph narratives are the wisdom circles who believe in the power of reason and practicality and aren't so tied up with divine will. So the story itself does not bring God into the picture, except the way Joseph from time to time appeals to him. Let's think about my brother and me just for a minute. Why do we spend time, and sometimes they're difficult conversations, why do we have these conversations? Well, because we love one another, but also because we believe in something. We believe in brotherhood or harmony. And there is relationship, for sure, and it's powerful. But there's also a third thing, isn't there? A principle that also empowers us. You know, anybody heard of the 20th century philosopher Ernst Cassirer? Cassirer. Cassirer wrote a series of books, 3 books, called The Philosophy of Symbolic Forms. And he deals with art, language, myth, and religion as symbolic systems that the human mind creates. And he's a kind of progressive in terms of his understanding. And when he thinks about the powers, primitive persons believed in the powers in objects, that there is force all around us. Mythic thinking eliminates the powers in objects and puts them in the gods. And the gods are rivalrous with one another. Monotheism, the next step, focuses that on one power who has an influence on human life. The next step for Cassirer is to take God as a person, say the Bible's view, and make God a principle, the source of ethical behavior. For Kassir, this is the next step in the progressive development of this notion of power. Monotheism is a late stage, but not the last stage, because it still makes the source of power something above. The next step is to return the power to us, who have responsibility to act what? According to a principle. In other words, the role of God structurally is maintained. There's something above us, but what's above us is not causing action, but a principle to which we appeal to know how to act. And so when you ask, does God always have to be involved? I'm going to give a one-word answer to this question with a footnote. Yes. But it depends on how one understands that slot that God fills, or earlier that the gods filled. Powers. Ethical principles don't act. They can be acted upon. And that's my argument about my brother in a little bit. Of course we face one another. Joseph and his brothers face one another in a long story. But they appeal to something beyond them to give them unity, and to which they appeal in order to heal themselves. They appeal to it. It doesn't act. In this sense, the answer is yes, we have to appeal to God. If you understand God, at least possibly, in Kassir's sense, as a late development that returns power to human beings. And part of our power as human beings is our capacity to act on principles. What do you think about that?
I think that's a good answer.
I like it too. Yeah. You know, this Kassir thing, yeah. Yep. Okay. Okay. So the process of forgiveness, I think what the Torah is suggesting here, I mean, look, one thing that is not the case is that my big deal about imitation of God, which I do think is an animating principle, doesn't apply to the Joseph story. Joseph is not doing it because God has done it. This comes out of the situation and out of him. But it's still an emulation of what the Torah in other places, many places, thinks of as the way God acts. Maybe there is a connection here, because it looks like, forget the literal, just to continue with my response to Jackie, your question. Forget that God acts to forgive. Maybe what can be understood as happening there is that when the Torah is saying God forgives, what it's really saying is, not really, I don't want to be reductive about it. It could be that God is doing it, many people do, but that forgiveness is now a principle. What God does can be understood as a principle of the moral life, to which we ought to have some allegiance. So God doesn't need to be understood anthropomorphically as a kind of human being, only more so, but as the elements of transcendence, things that transcend our daily activities and inform our daily activities if we appeal to them. Yeah. Even Aristotle, who believes that you can't tell in advance how to act. It depends on the situation. Stealing is wrong. But is it wrong for a person who is a pauper and has a family at home, And the society is not, I don't want to blame this on society, but it has a dire situation. To take a couple of apples from the basket of the grocer, if I'm a Kantian, that stealing is always wrong, no matter what the situation. But wouldn't we say that there is a situational aspect to ethics? Even though Aristotle, I think, would say that there are certain principles, but we can't automatically apply a principle to a situation. We have to, that's his cognitive, that reason matters. We have to see in the situation in what is required. The imperative emerges from the particular. All right, I want to do, oh my goodness. So let's do this. Since it's time to stop, I just want to raise a point for our discussion for next week. And that is just to continue this notion of ethical principles. There is a dispute in the Talmud, it's the Talmud, between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai over what is the central verse in the Torah. What verse captures the essence of the Torah? And here it is. I'm just going to read it, and then I'll ask a couple of questions and we'll stop. Rabbi Akiva taught that the central verse is, love your neighbor as yourself. That's the essence of Torah. Ben Azai says, the central verse is Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. This is the book of the chronologies of Adam. So, let's think about this, because I think we could understand the power of each of their views and also recognize the limitations of each. What is the power behind love your neighbor as yourself? But what is its limitation? What is the power behind Ben Azai's view? This is the book of the chronologies of Adam, who after all was made in the image of God. Let's go back here just for a second. This is the record of Adam's line. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. I think to get at Ben Azai's view, you have to add that as well. This is the chronology of the descendants of Adam, who was made in the image of God. So let's think about this. What's the power and the limit of each of these suggestions? I think they're both rich, but I think they both have limitations. So, what I want to do next, aside from looking at this, is to examine some of the basic moral dicta statements in Leviticus 19 about gossip, about hating your neighbor, about loving your neighbor, about rebuking your neighbor, because those are central ethical maxims in the Torah. And then I want to look at who teaches, who are the teachers, according to the Torah, of moral aspects of the moral life. And that may end our discussion on ethics, probably a couple of more weeks, and we'll get into hope. Okay, I'm so glad we're back together again. Come back. What's better than being three-dimensional together rather than just two-dimensional? What?
Look at your phone.
I look at my phone. What principle causes me to look at my phone?
Me.
Very good. The authority of the individual. Okay, yeah. One person wrote, David Brooks in his column yesterday, well, the topic is clerical authority of this message. David Brooks in his column yesterday went on at length about the abuses of clerical power as a destructive element in the evangelical church. You know, I feel some loyalty to other clergy and other religions, so I'm going to erase this message. No, I'm not. I'll respond to it. That looks like it. Very good. Okay. See you soon. Shabbat shalom.
Paper this morning, it said that pastor or something from some church nearby.
Anybody, my brother comes here from time to time. Does anybody, Carol, you've met my brother. Dennis, haven't you?
I think I met him once.
He hasn't been here for a couple of years. He's one of the greatest people I know, actually. We were recently, just a couple of weeks ago, in Penn State. We go to Penn State now because it's halfway between our homes. And we sat at breakfast at the restaurant from 10:30 to 4:30.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned, look at the teacher.
That's what I'm shoving.
And I think of that a whole lot, because I have a sister that,
Do you?
so close to estranged from, we talk so little, and
No, really.
I'm just
Well, I mean, this
recently been involved with her.
Good.
And I'm
He said
constantly
he knew when to quit. so.
tempering my behavior and how I act to
Yeah,
try to
well, I
make things right.
understand it.
Why are you
So
trying?
this
I mean, in other words, the kids
really,
in
really helpful to me.
I had
Why
a
are
shovel
you
little
trying?
ones after the guy plowed,
Why
it
am
was
I-
up against the garage door.
Because I believe in the ultimate principle of family, and she's all I have left, and because some part of me cares for her
On the seventh.
a whole lot in a way that no other person could fill that spot, because she's my sister, we're twins. Yes, we've always been together.
How about that? But you're alienating from something.
Yeah, right.
You believe in the idea of sisters,
Oh, boy.
the uniqueness of that relationship,
It's
the
about
power of
family.
family.
Well, see, I have a Subaru, you know, it has that four-wheel drive.
So
That is very
Although my car's
altruistic.
tiny,
I
so.
don't have a lot of reactions that
Yeah, it's just a Subaru
cause
Cresta,
me to
so.
leave it. A couple of things my parents said to me,
That should be,
and I
that's a
remember.
good car.
Remember, she's all you have.
I love it.
So
Only one sister.
fidelity to parents.
Yes, yes, that's part of it. That's part of it. Well, I don't know if it's nice, but it is. It's what's mine. That's
Well, there's tension
it's
inside
difficult.
you
Right.
between the relationship itself, which I assume is problematic, and other things which make the relationship singular, something that you want to cultivate. Are you making up therapeutic narratives at all?
I don't know.
What you did to me really hurt me at the time, but I can see, and now you make up a story that
It
allows.
makes me very cautious. I've thought of those things, therapeutic narratives, but I don't even know if she's ready for that, right? I don't know. I should come and talk to you about it.
Absolutely.
Probably.
I'd love to do that.
Right.
But in any event, I think you've talked to me a little bit about it before. But in any event, I'd love to know the progress of this adventure you're on.
Thank you.
Will it feel great if you can find a way to accept who she is and what she's done? I'm sure she would say the same thing about you, maybe. For the
Well,
sake-
yeah, if we just could come to terms on those grounds, it would be wonderful.
What about just deciding or taking a decision that there's something more important than the things that have happened?
Right.
And would you get some joy out of that?
Well, I would, but I don't know that that's a mutual feeling.
Has she had a good life or not a good life?
She's had a difficult life, her whole life,
And you've had a good life,
and I've had a good life.
so she's probably resentful, jealous.
Yes, I think so, but she would never admit that. Right. I definitely think so, but, you know, she gets in her own way. She create stumbling blocks for herself. that
Good to see
is
everybody.
very difficult.
It's good to be seen.
Would it be worth it for the two of you to have therapy?
Good to see you last night, too.
Oh.
Facilitate?
I don't think she would.
I waved, you waved back.
So
We
you,
can't even have a conversation
Well, what happened
without
was,
emotional.
I was gonna sit with
things
Jane
getting in the
Ross.
way.
you would like the relationship to be healed to some
But
degree,
then
but you
my
want the
cousin
same thing.
asked me to sit with him.
Is she fine with the way
And
it
then I
is?
didn't realize
I-
why.
if I stay out of her way,
way.
It,
Okay.
So he wanted as much.
I
family
think it's
together
better
as he could.
because, yeah,
So, and then I didn't realize it'd been,
any kind of relationship with me
62 years.
creates,
It's a long time.
It's a long time, well, it's been 3 years for me, it's a long time.
Yeah.
Any death.
she
Well,
doesn't
he was
enjoy
a little
looking at her, she
kid.
doesn't look at herself realistically.
I was only 12.
And it
But
creates
I remember
images
shiver
that,
because my
are
parents
unhappy
took me
for
there,
her.
of course, But
that she
I
doesn't
didn't
do
know what it was and what's
well.
going on.
And
Or what am I supposed
she
to do?
is not.
No, I didn't even know why we were
and not
there. I just
have that
remember the
sense of
scene.
peacefulness
I can
that
see it pretty
we
clear.
all desire in our lives.
And I just kept saying, why
And
are
does
we
this
here?
make her happy, all this
Why,
turmoil?
you know,
Being divorced from me makes her happy.
Lost her father.
Divorce you.
Yeah.
You were in ninth grade.
So you would like it to happen, but she's not, she doesn't.
Exactly.
Can you
I
reconcile
was
yourself to
startled
that?
that the.
Yeah, I have. Yeah. I have.
But still, you're
Well, there's,
exercising about it.
yeah, because I'm a hopeful
So-
person, right,
When,
right. But I've being able to
I mean, I knew I was
see
no
all
longer
of that
to pay respects because.
took
I
a
don't know
lot
why we were involved.
work and effort.
It just, they didn't follow along.
turmoil, and
At
it's
least that I know.
probably better.
But-
Like recently,
My daughter
I had to
paid
communicate with her,
respect.
but I did it online, and it was
Yeah.
easier doing an email than a
And
phone
then she.
call.
she-
And that was a lot better.
Did it work? Did she respond?
Initially, until we got into subjects that were difficult for her to handle. On the surface, yeah.
A good thing if.
Have you ever said to her,
Respects to
we've got a lot of difficulties, maybe it's never
And I
gonna
said,
work, but I'd like it to.
this is what it's called.
Yeah, I
this is
did.
what it
I
means.
did.
And she didn't respond.
Yeah, she responded with